it's 25 years ago that was the first Bluegrass Brawl in Pikeville, Kentucky, April 2nd, 1993. It's been 25 years. And that was our first really major show for reasons that we'll talk about. And so I thought we would go back and kind of examine the time period, because so many people have asked about it, and they seem to enjoy when we do deep dives behind the scenes. You can kind of hopefully get a better understanding of how a territory was run and operated, and the things that went on back in those days. And I guess we should start out by kind of setting the scene up. We had started television in Knoxville for Smoky Mountain Wrestling in February of 1992. And the rule of thumb was, and we should have waited longer if we could afford it, but the rule of thumb back in those days was wait 3 months on TV before you start running your live events in the town. So we debuted in the Knoxville Civic Coliseum in May of 1992. In Johnson City and Freedom Hall, which was our other big market, we weren't able to debut on TV until April, so we didn't debut there in live until July for the first time at Freedom Hall. And the two towns were kind of different. Obviously, they were both old parts of the Southeastern Territory, but in their day, Knoxville had been the Kazana promotion, and Johnson City was part of the Tri-Cities with Bristol and Kingsport, and had been Ron Wright's promotion, and they always worked back and forth together. And then both towns had been continental towns. But in Knoxville, our first market, we got on TV. There were 4 TV stations on the air in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1992, and we got on number 4. Because Channel 10, the Big Daddy, that aired Ron Fuller's Southeastern show in the 70s, and you could get everywhere for 100 miles. They weren't in the wrestling business anymore. They were doing network college basketball and the whole 9 yards, and it was not going to happen. Channel 8 carried the WCW program, and they were getting paid to do that, and they wanted too much money. Channel 6 did not have anything on the schedule, so we ended up at Fox 43 when the Fox network was, I think, broadcasting 4 nights a week or whatever. It's only a couple years old. So we didn't have a great reach, and it was especially weak on the west side of Knoxville. But in the Tri-Cities for Johnson City, we were able to get on WCYB TV Channel 5, the NBC affiliate, strongest station in the market. You could get it through over the air 100 miles in every direction, even up in the mountains. And we got a great time Saturday at 11:30 in the morning, because there was a sympathetic sales manager there that believed in us, and we had to pay, but we didn't have to pay a ridiculous amount. And they got part of the commercial time, so it was a great deal. And we didn't have problems with that station until he left in 1995, when everything was going to shit. So we had debuted in Knoxville to success, actually, for the first year. The debut in Johnson City, because the TV station was stronger, actually outdrew Knoxville and had done better. And a few of the shows in Johnson City had done better than the shows in Knoxville. But both of them were slow developing. Because in terms, our spot shows hit right away, and I hope I'm not going into too much minute detail, but spot shows, the little high school and college gyms or rec centers that you would run in the smaller towns in the outlying areas, they started coming along pretty well as soon as we got television, because it had been several years since Continental had folded and those towns had had any wrestling with any kind of stars. And there weren't that many independents in those days. Even back in those days, there weren't that many outlaws. So they hadn't seen a lot of live wrestling. And plus, there was not a lot to do in those towns, as you will see. So the spot shows were doing well, but I couldn't pop either Knoxville or Johnson City to do above a $10,000 house. And back in those days, our ringside was $8, general admission was $6, kids was $5. And in a lot of spot shows, sometimes we just do a 6 and 5. So Knoxville and Johnson City had both topped out at like $8,000 something, right? And I had not been able to do better than that. But what I had hit upon at the start of 1993 was the deal with Bill Watts, where we did the cross promotion with WCW. And I was thinking in that way, I could get some more exposure We've talked about the deal that I had with Watts before. They weren't going to run live events in Knoxville, WCW. He was going to, if it had got that far, he was going to see what he could do with their syndication about finding a place for us on a stronger station there in Knoxville. But he agreed to protect our East Tennessee area and Eastern Kentucky area from running live events against us. And we were going to be changing talent, whether it was him sending guys like he did Bobby Eaton to freshen up for 90 days, or if he was changing somebody's gimmick or somebody was rehabbing from an injury, or vice versa. He had gotten Paul Orndorff from me and wanted to, open that relationship. So that was where we were starting. And we ended up right before the SuperBrawl pay-per-view in February was when Watts called me and said, well, I'm on my way home. And everybody has had their put their 2 cents worth in. And I know the fat guy in Pittsburgh, but he's a fucking liar about everything else in life, and he's a miserable piece of shit. But he wants to take credit for Watts getting fired by Turner Broadcasting Management. But I've always had a problem with that, because Watts called me the week before and said, I'm on my way home and I'm putting our deal in writing for you. Because we had done all this on a handshake, and our deal was that for me coming up with the angle for the tag team match on their SuperBrawl pay-per-view between the Heavenly Bodies and the Rock and Roll Express, the use of the talent, basically the performance of the whole 9 yards, and open the opportunity with Smoky Mountain and WCW working together, he was paying me $25,000 for the deal. And I was going to pay the boys out of that, and it was well-needed money for the office. Because I told him, I said, they just spent what had to be $50,000 to shoot a fucking movie where a midget blew up a boat to promote your pay-per-view. So instead, I will give you the hottest babyface team that TBS ever had on its television against a team managed by me, their arch rival, with the services of our commissioner, Bob Armstrong, who's a Georgia legend, and I'll come up with the whole deal from start to finish creatively and just give it to you so you can plug it in the TV for $25,000, half that. He said, done, and we shook hands on it, right? Well, he called me and told me that he was going to be going home, and he said, and they're going to fuck you. So I'm putting our deal in writing, and I'm faxing it to you, and I'm mailing you a signed copy, and he did. And that's how I was able to get my check for this whole schmear that's why we did SuperBrawl even after Watts left, because they had a signed deal they couldn't get out of. Have I told that story before? Certainly I have.
Some of it, but I have to ask you a question, but I also have to make a correction here. The midget had not yet blown up the boat, but Cheatham, the WCW midget, had appeared in the Spin the Wheel, Make the Deal promo, and then Vader's White Castle of Fear.
Oh, that's right. So, okay, yes, it was so they built a Fortress of Solitude for the midget Spin the Deal or whatever the fuck.
White Castle of Fear.
Spent too well, and Leon does like his burgers. But no, he's been in bad health, so I shouldn't say that.
Let me ask you this, though. Between, let's say, 1987 and this point in time, let's say the end of 1992, had you stayed in touch with Bill Watts? How often had you actually spoken to him?
He called me. I had not stayed in touch with him since he'd been out of the business, but he called me in late 92 to ask me how Paul Orndorff was doing, because Paul had been working for me. I was bringing him and Ronnie Garvin in. They were having great matches and on my television. It gave us credibility with two names like that. And he was wanting to bring Paul in. He said, how's he been? I said, he's great, because his arm's back in better shape and his work is fantastic. And of course, Watts had years before told me the motto that he always lived by in Mid-South when Vince Sr. would call him and say, hey, how's Waldo Von Erich? Oh, he's great, Vince. He's great, because he knew that Vince wanted Waldo Von Erich. And he knew that if he said he was great and said, when would you like him, Vince? I can finish him up. Then he would get a week on the Giant, Andre, and he'd sell out every night in his fucking territory. If you've ever noticed, if the Andre worked in Mid-South wrestling a lot in the late 70s, early 80s there. And it was always whenever fucking Vince Sr. needed a new heel for his champion.
Well, also, anyway, what else was Watts going to do? Because honestly, if Vince Sr. wanted him, Vince Sr. was going to take him. It was a courtesy that he was extending to Bill Watts, and it worked out in his favor. But
exactly,
what was it like for you? I mean, the last conversations you had with him, you had been just I hate to use the word performer, but you had been just a manager. Now here you are, you own a piece of an office and you're the booker. Was the relationship different when he called?
Well, actually, no, he wasn't telling me what to do because I wasn't working for him, but he actually, I think at that point, he liked having, because he would always, as soon as I'd answer the phone, he'd say, hold on a second. You hear him walk over and close his door. He enjoyed having somebody that he could talk to that understood the language of the wrestling business. And it was kind of like fun for him instead of because he told me about how the executives and the people, and they always had their hand in it and always were trying to suggest shit. And they didn't understand the business. And I think that drove him crazy, the people he had to deal with. So he could actually talk wrestling for a minute. And, when he asked me about Paul, and he said, well, how's so-and-so doing? And I just reunited Ricky and Robert. And that was what led to, not only him inviting me to come down to the office and talk about shit, but me obviously having an idea about what to talk about once I got there because of what he had taught me in 1984. If you're in the wrestling business and you're a heel or a babyface and you show up to work without a finish in mind that you can lose without hurting yourself or you can win without hurting the other guy, then you're a carpenter without his tools. Well, I'm going down to talk to Bill Watts about potentially working together. What am I going to do? I'm going to pitch him a fucking angle with my top guys to get my promotion publicity and a payoff. And it was good enough that he didn't even argue with me about it.
He found the right person if he wanted to commiserate about the awfulness of Turner executives. He found the right guy to call and close the office door to.
Oh, he's the one that named Kip Fry Francis Ford Kippola. He said, this fucking guy, he's paying the guys to show up. He's paying the guys extra if they actually show up to work the job that we're paying them to do to begin with. And he was. And it was chaos. And they didn't, but I was hoping it would last, but there was no way that Bill Watts could get, like when Watts left Connecticut and told Vince there's only room for one Titan in Titan Sports. There were still a lot of people that Bill Watts was not going to be able to coexist with down there in that office environment. But anyway, that brings us up kind of the start of our time period because when that happened, SuperBrawl 93 was February 21st in Asheville, North Carolina. And that was the first time that we'd worked for WCW in over 2 years since we had left. And it was done with the invasion where they announced that they were bringing the Rock and Roll Express in for a special appearance on WCW. And they showed footage from Smoky Mountain of them beating the Heavenly Bodies up and me. And then we crashed their interview live where we hid in the broom closet. So like 1 o'clock that afternoon, the boys didn't even know we were there. And we actually went around the front of the building, came in from the sidewalk and stormed in through the theater and busted up the whole thing and had the impromptu match and Watts got involved. And then it led to Commissioner Bob Armstrong working together on Atlanta TV or TBS TV with Watts to put the match together between the Heavenly Bodies and the Rock and Roll Express for SuperBrawl. And that's where we were that weekend. We had a show February 19th, Friday night in Knoxville. Because in addition, and that's when Bill had sent me Bobby Eaton. And so I made the Bodies a three-man team, Bobby Eaton, Stan Lane, and Tom Pritchard. Because he wanted to they'd had Bobby doing stupid shit, and he just wanted Bobby to go away for 3 months and come back fresh, right? And he was going to do a bunch of shit with him. And the Bodies were working against the Rock and Roll Express for the Smoky Mountain Tag Team Championship, but also we had a three-way tag team issue going on with Robert Fuller, Jimmy Golden, and Dutch Mantell, who were the stud stable. And they were nominally heels as well, so the Rock and Roll could be in the sympathetic position, but we were mad at them also. And the other programs going on were the Smoky Mountain title program between Tracy Smothers and the Dirty White Boy, and Kevin Sullivan was in the middle of the whole thing with Brian Lee after he'd been revealed as the master and had stabbed Brian 37 times or whatever with the golden spike. So that's pretty much what was drawing the money in our territory. On February 19th in Knoxville, we had basically a 6-match card, but it was 4 matches featured. Smoky Mountain title, Tracy versus White Boy, First Blood match, Kevin Sullivan versus Brian Lee, Bodies versus the Rock and Roll for the Smoky Mountain tag title, and a 6-man lights out match where the Bodies came back along with Bobby Eaton against Fuller, Golden, and Dutch Mantell. And that show drew 1,014 people paid, 173 comps, and the gate was $6,851. And that was about as good as we had been able to do in Knoxville or Johnson City to that point. Like I said, the big towns, it was hard to. But for example, we went to Bland, Virginia on Saturday night at the Bland High School, sponsored by the Volunteer Fire Department, and drew 375 paid for $2,363. We drew like a third of the house in Knoxville in Bland, Virginia. Population maybe 1,500. And that was a pretty slow spot show for that period in time. But anyway, I come to the day. A lot of people don't know this, but Sunday, February 21st, the day of the SuperBrawl pay-per-view in Asheville, we had a Smoky Mountain show in Johnson City, and the Bodies worked it too that afternoon.
I forgot about that.
Yes, because when they gave me the date, it was the only date we could get Freedom Hall in Johnson City that month, right? And so, hey, so here's what we did. Asheville and Johnson City are only 60 miles apart. Now, back then, it was a challenging 60 miles because it wasn't all 4-lane yet over the mountain down to fucking Asheville. So, or up to Asheville. It's all down and up. So it took about 2 hours. But what we did was the card in Johnson City, we didn't put the Rock and Roll Express on it. As a result, we didn't do very well. But it was Tracy and White Boy for the title. No disqualification with Kevin Sullivan and Brian Lee, and Eaton, Lane, and Pritchard against Fuller, Golden, and Dutch. And 2 other matches, and we did 578 paid, 54 comps, and like $4,000. But that was at 2:00. So we finish up, boom, hop in the car, and drive down to Asheville and get there at like 6:00 to do the pay-per-view. And we were in the ring by 9 or whatever. But it was the Bodies and the Rock and Roll. They could have had that match in their sleep, and we pretty much stole the show, although it was petty theft in large part. But that was the end of February. So that's kind of where we were. And I wanted to start with March because a lot of things went on, and you can kind of get a good grasp of what our business was like at the time and who figured into it and who was really drawing the money. And we started on March 1st in Sevierville, Tennessee, which is the same thing as Pigeon Forge. They're next to each other, but it's right there at the foot of the Smokies, and a little small town. And they had Caton's Chapel Elementary School, probably seated the gym, 800 people. Well, and we'd only use one side. If we get 300 people or 400 people in a small building like that, we'd shoot toward one side and it'd be great. Well, on this one, it was so jammed that we ended up drawing 650 people at $6 a head, $38.94. And so they were pretty much everywhere except for the area that we had set aside for the interview set and the lights and the entranceway and everything, and they were pretty much surrounding everything else. And that's the night that Kanemaru bladed his arm. Ooh. And that's the night that Victor Quinones had brought the Japanese guys, and it brought Bill DeMott in it when he was still Crash the Terminator, and Miguel Perez Jr. And so Kevin Sullivan with the golden spike at Caton's Chapel Elementary in Sevierville, right down from Dollywood, rips his Japanese kid open. And we told the story when we talked about it on the program, and he had to go to the hospital afterwards. Here's a guy that speaks no English in wrestling tights with his arm laid open, getting sewed up while the Puerto Rican guy is waiting on him in the funny outfit. And that little town, it was exciting. But that's also the night that we had Arn Anderson revealed as the mystery partner under the sheet, because even though Bill was gone, see, that's what I was worried about, because I already had this plan for March to draw some money with Arn. He had given me like 4 or 5 dates on Arn, so he put that in the contract also, and they had to honor it. So, and people have seen the clip on YouTube or Twitter or whatever, but it was the actual reason why hokey local wrestling worked so good, because there is me and the Bodies and the Rock and Roll Express and a guy under a fucking sheet, and we're in an elementary school, even though it's jam-packed and people are screaming. And you would set up to be, well, this can't be anything, but this has to be some hokey bullshit under the sheet, right? Or they would have gone to some trouble. And I cut the promo, and when I whipped the sheet off and it's Arn Anderson, the place blew. The babies went in the air, and they have the fight, and Arn backdrops Bobby Eaton on the floor, and oh my God. And that really kicked the thing off. So we had some strong TV going into all of these big towns that I had lined up. So that was a nice night of TV there in Sevierville. And then on March the 5th, we went to Council, Virginia. Now, if you can look these towns up if you want to, but I'm pretty sure if the population of Council was 3,000, I'll eat your hat. It was off the WCYB Tri-Cities television that went up in the hills like that. And the cable system, one of the guys told me in one of the towns up there, only had 8 or 10 channels, even on cable. And what you got depended on what the guy wanted to pull in and give you. So they could get like one TV station over the air, and it was ours. So we had 690 paid in Council, Virginia for $4,400 to see the Rock and Roll against Lane and Pritchard, who were the bodies at the time, Tracy against White Boy, Kevin Sullivan against Brian Lee, and Bobby Eaton against Tim Horner, and a 10-man battle royal.
It's a good card.
And but at the same time, because most of the guys were on, depending on various times, they were on a per night or a weekly guarantee, but it worked out to $150 a night usually for the top guys, and $75 or $100 for the underneath and middle card guys. Of course, the Rock and Roll were making a bend on gimmicks. But in a lot of these spot shows with 10 guys and a referee, my talent cost was $1,500, $1,800 to have a lineup like that with all those known names. That's why we didn't have 8 matches with 25 guys, because I'd rather have 10 guys they know and will come to see. And then the following night, we go to Morganton, North Carolina, at the Collette Street Rec Center, Old Crockett Town, off of our little Hickory local television. And we had 484 that paid $3,519 for the same card. And the following weekend, in Oliver Springs, Tennessee, which was a little bit west of Knoxville. And as I mentioned, our coverage west on TV was not great there. That's why we didn't run west of Knoxville that often. But Oliver Springs, the Norwood Middle School, basically the same card, 424, paid $2,853. And these were all spot shows. And what that means, because I've found out that a lot of people don't know these days how it worked, you would go and you would find, or they would find you, a sponsoring group in these local towns, whether it was the fire department or the police department, because they needed new equipment. And the fire department in a lot of these towns might have 1 truck and there might be 6 firemen. But they needed new equipment, or the athletic boosters at the high school for the football team, or the parent-teacher association. They want to buy the kids new uniforms, or they want to take the kids down to Chattanooga to see the big game or whatever. They needed to raise money. And in a lot of these towns, instead of having bake sales or flea markets, or which they would do also, they would sponsor wrestling. So if we went into Oliver Springs at the Norwood Middle School, let's say the football team was our sponsor, they would provide us with the location to have the matches for free, the school. They would staff it, because they were also going to get all the food and drink concessions. So they would staff it with all the people needed to sell the tickets and take the tickets and sell the hot dogs. And they would also sell the advance tickets at their school or their businesses, people that were in the Parent-Teacher Booster Association or affiliated with the school. They would get the newspaper and radio publicity. If there was a radio station in town, we'd send them tapes and they'd play them for free. Or they'd get newspaper ads for free, because probably the newspaper editor, his kid went to the fucking school. So all the publicity was free. We would send them 100 posters and 1,000 flyers and charge them $75 for that. And they were allegedly going to put them up all over town or put them out all over town. And where you found out who were your good sponsors and who were your bad ones is sort of like the old fucking joke. You know, the Buddy Wayne said, I came in and found 100 posters in the ditch behind the gym. They never put them out. That's why we've only got 26 people. That actually would happen sometimes. But you would also find good sponsors. And for this, they would get 25% of the gate. So it was in their interest to draw as many people as possible, because every other person was more money for them. All we had to do was have the wrestlers show up, have a ring announcer, a referee, and the crew that hauled the ring and put it up. And that was the sum total of expense or work that we had in the show. That's why spot shows were a staple of wrestling for so many years. It was very low risk. And when you found your good sponsors, then you could depend on them time after time. So these shows may sound now with modern, the people sound good, but the money sounds bad with modern expenses and the way of doing things. But no, these shows actually didn't really, were negligible money losers, and sometimes often made a little bit of money. And it kept the guys paid and working. But anyway, the following night, we go to Morristown with Eaton Lane and Pritchard on March 12th. Eaton Lane and Pritchard against the Rock and Rollin' Horner, because it was Morristown. It was his hometown. As you'll see, 291 paid $2,041. We couldn't even get him paid to see Horner in Morristown. Sullivan and Lee in a first blood match, and Tracy and White Boy in a title match. But remember, Morristown is only 30 miles from Knoxville, and we ran Morristown every month. We ran Knoxville every month. Then on March 13th, we were in Beckley with basically the same card, and I actually didn't record that, and I'm pretty sure that Beckley was probably not a shining example of our business at the time. But the following weekend, it starts to get interesting. On March 18th, we were in Farmville, Virginia, which was off the Beckley TV, I think, because it was an old Crockett town. Bodies Rock and Roll, Tracy and White Boy, Pritchard against Horner, and Taz. Actually, the Tasmaniac against Chris Candido, because that was the first time that Chris came down and Taz rode with him. So at any rate, in Farmville, Virginia, we got it was a sold show. We got $1,400. And there were 200. No, I'm sorry. I tell a lie. That's just a figure I'd written down. There were 295 people paid for $2,187. 10 guys on the card and a referee. But then we went to Barberville on March 19th. And in Barberville at Knox Central High School, hello to all the folks down in Eastern Kentucky, this was the classic example of local promotion. Dennis Chestnut of Chestnut's Tax Service was the town gadabout, and everybody knew him. And he talked to everybody. He did business with everybody. And he was on the school fundraising board or whatever. He did all kinds of events for Knox Central High School to raise money for the athletic teams or the cheerleaders or just anything. And so we hooked up with him early on, and Barberville became a monthly town. And he was the guy that did everything right. The publicity was always put out. The posters were always hung. It was an area that was easily accessible for a lot of people in Eastern Kentucky. I don't know that the population of Barberville today is 10,000 itself, but it's 20 miles down the road from Corbin, and it's close to, this and that. And once again, these high schools, usually there was only one high school in a particular county, and all the kids went there. Well, in this case, it was Knox Central. I think they had a Knox North or a Knox South. I can't remember, but there was two. But this was the nice one. And so we ran there every month, and we tried to do more special shows there. And so this one, we had a grudge 6-man, where that was the first night that Arn was in. We revealed it on TV a week or two out when the tape played, but it was Bobby Eaton, Tom Pritchard, and Stan Lane against the Rock and Roll Express and Arn Anderson, Tracy and White Boy for the title, Lee and Sullivan in a first blood match, Tim Horner and the Night Stalker in a return match, and then Jimmy Golden against, I believe, Chris Michaels. 738 people paid $4,697, and that was for a monthly town. And in those days, that was a good spot show, because when you think about it, in Barberville, if it was real bad weather or a sorry card, the house was $3,000 or thereabouts. If it was really good, it was $6,000 or $6 something. So if you say that we averaged $4,000 to $5,000 a show 12 times a year, we were grossing $60,000 a year in Barberville, and the athletic boosters or the school in general was getting about a quarter of that. So they were looking at plus the food concessions. Their profit off of wrestling was in the tens of thousands of dollars a year at that point. So they liked it. And once again, these are small towns with small schools and small school systems, and bake sales meant something to them to accomplish their goals. Anyway, the following night we go to Johnson City at Freedom Hall, and where we had done, I believe, $40-something the month before, and we had the 6-man with the Rock and Roll and Arn and the Bodies, plus Tracy and White Boy and Kevin and Brian Lee in the First Blood, and did 930 paid, 41 comps, and 61.78. So we're starting to come up. Sunday, March 21st, in Knoxville, was the best house that we had done in Knoxville to that point. We made it different. We went with the 6-man and the title match, but we went with Sullivan and Brian Lee in the Russian roulette death match, and Taz did a run-in. where I believe, but the Russian roulette, that was the boxes in the corner, right? Yeah, because basically we had our ring guy build 4 wooden boxes that could set on an apparatus on top of the ring post, and we painted them yellow so they look nice. And the deal was 3 would be empty, but 1 would have the golden spike. And they had to start the match and incapacitate the other guy and go to a box and find the spike, and then you could use it legally. So Brian Lee could potentially spike Kevin Sullivan and bust him open with his own gimmick, right? And we did this in a number of places, but the people liked it, and it built the suspense. And except for the one night, I think Brian forgot and went to the box that was loaded before he was supposed to, and looked in and shut it. Like, oh fuck. But anyway, but that showed some life in Knoxville, because we drew 1,227 paid. We had 91 comps out because we had sponsors like Spectrum Rents, and we would give the radio stations tickets and trade for plugs. But the gate was $8,280. As I said, that's about the best that we had done. But once again, in 90s wrestling economics and in the territory days, we went to the Knoxville Civic Coliseum once a month. We had 12 dates a year, and Sandy Scott, and they had a great history with wrestling and wanted wrestling because they knew that it had potential to be a revenue generator for them at a time when the Coliseums the older ones were being phased out. So the Knoxville Civic Coliseum is a 6,000 seat building, and we didn't use the whole setup, but you get 6,000 people in there. And we would use a setup where the curtain was in the back and blocked off some of the upper general admission seats and didn't put the risers down. So capacity for us was closer to almost 5. But point being, it's a big regular arena where the professional hockey team played in town, where they did have big concerts and events. Sandy Scott negotiated a deal where our rent and expenses, the rent on the building, 10 ticket takers and ushers and ticket sellers, 6 uniformed police, and the Ticketmaster charges and other building costs for this night. Take a guess.
I have no way of guessing this.
6,000 seat arena in town, all those people, staffing, the rent on the whole 9 yards. $2,965.
Come on.
God, I've got the documentation. Because we were on it. See, here's the thing. If the wrestling promoters knew what they were doing, would get a base rent versus a percentage. And if the building was amenable to it, and especially if it one of the buildings down south and in Tennessee that had these long histories of great success with wrestling, it might be $1,000 versus 12%. Now, if whichever is greater. But still, you would think that the 12% on the houses they were used to drawing, like, $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000, but we only did $8,000. See, so there was ways to do it, and I'll give you an example here in a minute on Johnson City. But nevertheless, so that was a successful weekend, in that Arn came in and made a big splash. And that's the match I was talking about, Rock and Roll and Arn against Bobby and Stan and Tom was on Blood Brawls and Grudges, available at JimCornette.com. And then the following day, on Monday, March 22nd, we had to pick up another TV because March was a long month, and we did a 2-camera shoot without a full truck in Haysai, Virginia, at the Haysai High School. That's back up off WCYB. Folks, if you get the atlas, look in the westernmost part of Virginia, up in the hills, these small towns. They were hotbeds for wrestling because they had motivated sponsor groups that would get the people out. And in Haysai, Virginia, for a TV taping, we advertised Rock and Roll against Bodies and Sullivan and Stalker against Brian Lee and Tim Horner and Tracy against White Boy. And we gave them that in either a dark match or some kind of TV angle. And we did 3 shows with 2 cameras hooked up to some decks on a lunchroom table. And we drew 661 people that paid about $4,000, $6 a head. And we got 3 more weeks of TV for, probably a couple $1,000s per show finished. Then the following weekend, the last weekend of the month is tough. So it was a little rough, but Bluff City, Tennessee, at Sullivan East High School did 121 people that paid $814.
Ooh.
Yeah, it was brutal, but it was the Rock and Roll Express and Tim Horner against Lane Eaton and Pritchard, White Boy against Tracy, Jimmy Golden against Brian Lee, and then Tim Horner against Tom Pritchard in a captain's match. So there was 10 guys on the card, but the sponsors, it was a secret we were there. Let's put it that way. I remember that. Secret.
Yeah, Tim Horner working twice that night.
Well, maybe that may have been. But then the following night, we go back to Clinchport, Virginia, which is not far from Hayside and Clinchco and Council. At the Rye Cove High School, 574 paid $3,864 to see the same basic 10 guys. And the following night, Saturday, March 27th, in Saltville at the Northwoods Middle School, I added Mike Sampson against Jimmy Golden. We had 12 guys on the card, and 500 people paid $3,204. And I believe I added Mike Sampson because he lived down the road and could actually help make sure the posters were hung. And then Sunday, March 28th, we did a night show in Beckley, West Virginia, and did a promotion with the television station. So the tickets were $8 ringside, $6 general admission, and kids under 12, 99 cents. And we got 77 of those little buggers. 442 people paid for $2,698. Now, this was we could never get Beckley. We could not get, the best I think we ever did in Beckley was $4,000. And finally, I just gave up because it was the farthest trip, but we had WOAY TV Channel 4 in Oak Hill, West Virginia, which is next door to Beckley. It's, same general area. And there are only 2 TV stations in central West Virginia in between Roanoke, Virginia, Charleston, West Virginia, and fucking Asheville, North Carolina. In that, there's 400 miles. There's only 2 TV stations. WOAY4 is one of them, and Channel 6 in Bluefield, West Virginia, is the other one. And I figured we got Saturday night at 11:30 on one of the only 2 TV stations a lot of these people can get. And Beckley was a hotbed for Crockett. We could never get them to come back. We did Sunday afternoon. We did Sunday night right after the Saturday night playings. We did a Saturday a time or two. They just wouldn't come. And finally, we gave up on it. But Beckley is, of course, where the Midnight Express and I were memorialized in the West Virginia law books. To hear Stephen P. New talk about it, where we had that lawsuit. And in 1987, the Rock and Roll Express against the Midnight Express sold the place out. It holds 4,000 people or whatever. And there wasn't a seat to be had. And I have the same guys fighting each other in 1993, and we drew 442 paid. So sometimes they just wouldn't come. But to give you an example of another sweetheart deal that Sandy Scott, this is the only arena in town that anybody knows where it is or goes to, right? Besides a skating rink. It's a 4,000-seat arena in Beckley, the Raleigh County Armory. Everybody in the state knows where this thing is. It's a professional building with professional ticket windows and takers and nice locker room facilities, etc. You know what the rent and expenses was for us that night?
No.
$930. And once again, Sandy got us the TV slot because the general manager of the TV station that had been there for years and years enjoyed on Saturday night when the kids went to bed and he was able to sit down and watch his news and his wrestling with a scotch. And the building loved Sandy and wanted wrestling, and not that many people were renting on Sundays, so here you go. So anyway, Monday, March 29th, Newport, Tennessee at the National Guard Armory. This was a big card. Tim Horner versus Dutch Mantell, Tracy Smothers versus the Dirty White Boy, the Rock and Roll Express versus the Bodies of Lane and Pritchard, and an 8-man battle royal with Mark Curtis that made 9. 324 people paid $2,183, and we made a profit.
There you go.
Because we rented the Armory for $250. Okay, here we go. This is the meat of the matter. Have I given them a pretty good idea of what led up to the Bluegrass Brawl and what was going on as far as business-wise with Watts, as far as business-wise with the Gates, and the idea that these 3 teams were fighting with each other, and that White Boy and Tracy in the Smoky Mountain Heavyweight title picture and Kevin Sullivan and Brian Lee were really what was drawing our money?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the point is, if you were watching Smoky Mountain Wrestling TV, really from the end of fall 1992, everything had been building to this.
You are correct, sir. Well, I mean, we'd had some blow-offs and things at Christmas along the way, but you always, you couldn't, And that's the thing is you couldn't just get heat anymore, especially over a period of that many months without giving the baby faces life and hope. So each person had gotten some retribution, but the final revenge was waiting to be gotten. So, and I will mention that on Thursday, April 1st, we went to Hurley, Virginia at the Hurley High School with 12 guys, including Rip Rogers and Robbie Eagle, and did 522 paid for $3,266 in Hurley. I don't think there's 500 people in Hurley. But it was leading up to the Bluegrass Brawl on April 2nd in Pikeville, Kentucky. And at the time, I really didn't realize this was where it was leading to, because I was going to go to the Knoxville and Johnson City cards in the middle of April with the program between White Boy and Tony and the 3-team showdown and the whole 9 yards. And that's where I made a booking mistake that we'll talk about. But I had known since the start of the year that I wanted to make Pikeville a big show, because Sandy had called me and told me that he got the sponsors were the College Alumni Association. And back before, they've got a nice new 6,000 seat building in Pikeville now. And at the time, by the way, that we used to go, when you drive into Pikeville, Kentucky, the sign said, "Welcome to Pikeville, population 6,500. And that was in the mid-90s. They now have a building that for the area that can seat 6,000, nice brand new building. But at the time, the Pikeville College gym that seated almost 2,000, I think it was supposed to be 1,500 for basketball. That was the biggest gym in town and for a ways around. But the College Alumni Association, they wanted to raise money for their sports program or something. They got a hold of Sandy, and the deal they were going to do is, because since they were wired up to everybody in town, they were going to put the advance tickets on sale. Not only were we going to get the first Friday of the month, and folks, I hate to tell you, but the first Friday of the month, for very good reason, was always, or the first of the month was always the time where they ran the big wrestling shows in those days, because that's when the government checks came out. And the end of the month was when you were sucking hind tit, as we used to say, and short of things, and that's why you never ran your big towns at the end of the month. And it worked, and it was valid for many years. So we're going to go on the first Friday of the month. We're going to put the tickets on sale 5 weeks in advance or whatever, so we get the first Friday, which is also payday of March, as a ticket-selling gimmick. And we're going to put the tickets on sale at all the banks in town. So when you come in and get your check, cash your check or deposit your check or whatever, hey, you want to buy the wrestling tickets to benefit the College Alumni Association.
Perfect.
So, and they were just really motivated, and by that time we also had WYMT Channel 57, WYMT, your mountain television, in Hazard, Kentucky, which is the only broadcasting television station at that point in time in between Lexington and Knoxville, which was a distance of 180 miles. And really one of only 2 TV stations, if that the folks in the mountains without satellite dishes could get over the air. It was WYMT. It was an isolated world even back as recently as the 90s. So we had everything. And I put in a Golden Circle ticket. The first 2 rows we jacked up to $15 because the local Domino's Pizza agreed to supply the pizzas for the meet and greet in exchange for the advertising. So we sent the baby faces out half an hour early to have pizza and sign autographs for the Golden Circle ticket holders. And they sold out the first day we put them on sale. Like to 24 to 60, 160 or so Golden Circle tickets at $15 a piece. So I wanted to make it a special card. And then when I realized right about the time we went on sale that it was going to be even better, I said, let's shoot a fucking video. Let's take the truck. Let's shoot a home video, which was VHS in those days. And that's when I was able not only to get Les Thatcher, because Les at the time, Bob Caudle was doing my Bob Caudle was doing the regular TV with Dutch Mantell doing color. And Dutch was doubling as announcing and wrestling in the stud stable. Les Thatcher had come down and done some of my big weekend events, but Les still had a job in Cincinnati. And he couldn't travel during the week, and we did TV on Monday, and we'd been lucky enough. I wanted to put Bob and Les together more often, but we'd been lucky enough that Bob was retired at that point and didn't mind traveling over from North Carolina. Anyway, but for this one, just because it was close enough to Lexington, and I was thinking old days, I got Les Thatcher from Southeastern Wrestling in Knoxville that these people had seen years before, and Lance Russell came up from Memphis and I remember he brought Audrey. They made a trip of it, and I think took a few days off in the mountains or whatever, but he came all the way to Pikeville, and Lance and Les did that show for me. So it was the best of Memphis announcers and the best Southeastern announcer. So that was cool. But anyway, and that's why the VHS tape exists out there today, because we shot it. But the card was basically we had 6 matches, but it was a 3-match card, because I still, didn't want to go too overboard here. We had the main event was the Smoky Mountain Showdown. It was street fight rules. The last unbeaten team is the winner, and 3 men on each team: Bobby Eaton, Stan Lane, and Tom Pritchard. The Bodies versus Fuller, Golden, and Dutch, the Stud Stable, versus Morton and Gibson, the Rock and Roll, and Arn Anderson. That was Arn's final date with us. He started back WCW the following day. And that was the main event, and I'll explain what happened in a minute. But that was also the Tennessee chain match for the Smoky Mountain heavyweight title. And we brought Ron Wright back to be, or not back, but we brought Ron Wright to be in White Boy's Corner, because usually he only did TV in Knoxville, but I wanted everybody there, and that's where we decided to switch the title. And once again, everybody remembers that chain match, and Jesus Christ, the blood. And then the return Russian roulette match, where Tim Horner and the Night Stalker would be handcuffed to the ring post so they couldn't interfere with Kevin Sullivan and Brian Lee. And that's where Brian got his blow-off victory, and then Night Stalker turned babyface on Sullivan. The underneath matches that nobody remembers, we had Tim Horner against the Night Stalker, Robbie Eagle against Rip Rogers, and the Mongolian Stomper, just because I wanted the people to be able to see him, against Rob Morgan, who was Rip's driver at that point. And Stomper beat him in like a minute and a half. But it was a 3-match card, and everybody remembers the last 2 especially, because that street fight match was insane. I think it's the wildest match we ever had, and that's where we pulled out all the stops. That's where we did all the garbage stuff, but it meant something. That's where the fire extinguisher got pulled up out from under the ring so the babyface could make a comeback. And the table got thrown in so that all the heels could take bumps off of it instead of go through it. And Robert Gibson had even chased Bobby Eaton up a ladder in the back of the building, and Bobby had hung off the basketball goal, and then the ladder went out from under Robert Gibson without him expecting it, and he twisted his ankle, and I thought he broke his leg, and it almost put us out of business. And it was insane, and the people were throwing garbage, but the atmosphere was so good. And this is where I made a mistake, and I've always regretted this to this day. We ended up drawing 1,778 people paid for $12,187. The biggest Smoky Mountain show up to that time. When you count the college staff and the alumni association people and the sponsors working the concession stand and the TV crew and the wrestlers and everybody we had in that fucking old gym, it was 140 degrees. It had to be the humidity. I don't know what the fuck, because the walls were dripping. You couldn't hear the PA, you couldn't hear the music, and you couldn't hear the announcers because there were so many. We had put these big PA speakers up on the top row of the bleachers on both sides of the building. But because people were not only sitting in front of them, but actually sitting on top of them because they ran out of space to sit, they had covered up the speakers. So the people in the building couldn't hear. They were just reacting off a fucking sight. And the crowd was jacked, and it was the most amazing responsive crowd, especially in that small and enclosed of a space. But once again, Brian Lee got his retribution on Kevin Sullivan finally, and then Sullivan went off with Stalker, and Tracy Smothers defied the odds and gained revenge and won the title in the chain match. That's where the Klan had come to tell Tracy that if he didn't take care of White Boy and Ron for disrespecting and burning the Confederate flag on television, that they would. And luckily we knew the finish. So but Ron had some backup under his blanket in his chair, he said, just in case. And then the 3-team was insane, but I put the heels over in the main event because and I justified it to myself at the time. But then I realized afterwards that I was an inexperienced booker and how I could have done it. Brian comes out good. Tracy comes out of a bloodbath with his triumph and his championship. And I said, we're going to have blow-offs in 2 weeks in Knoxville and Johnson City between the bodies and the rock and roll, even though Arn is gone. I've got to keep, and the studs, I've got to keep this going. And so if I beat the bodies now, it'll take the edge off of it. So I had Dr. Tom's loaded boot knock Robert Gibson out, as I believe I remember when he was beating on me or something like that, or whatever the fuck happened. Point is, the heels win. And that was the last match. And the people booed and they got hot and the good kind of heat when they were mad at the heels. But it was flat. With that atmosphere, I should have put the baby faces over. Arn was, even though it was Arn's last night, I should have put the baby faces over with Arn Anderson setting up the Rock and Roll Express double drop kick, getting the pin or whatever, and then got some kind of heat if we dumped Arn out of the way and maybe the studs came back after we got the rock and roll down and got on the body, anything, an afterbirth, as we used to call it. And that could have showed on TV because this was also going to be a TV show. I got out of this one show, I got the biggest grossing house show that we had ever done. I got a VHS tape with announcers Lance Russell and Les Thatcher. And I also got an hour of television that we aired on the stations and showing this wildness and craziness with this incredible atmosphere. And I showed the finish where the heels fucked them. But as I was soon to find out, it wouldn't have worked anyway because of my timing. And I should have once again put the heels or the baby faces over for that pop that night. Those people would have never forgotten it. It was still amazing, but that would have been the true babies in the air that night. I've never had another crowd ready to see anything that I didn't give them any better than that. So that I've always felt bad about. But anyway, but still, Pikeville, Kentucky ended up doing our record crowd by almost $4,000 so far. And then we follow up the next night, Saturday, April 3rd, with K96 Radio Night in Morristown. We had Bobby Eaton, Stan Lane, and Tom Pritchard against the Rock and Roll and Horner in a barbed wire cage, and White Boy against Tracy for the title with no DQ, new champion. I false booked and advertised Kevin Sullivan and the Night Stalker against Brian Lee and the Stomper, because then the night before when the Night Stalker turned, of course we did not have Sullivan and Stalker team up. We instead did a goddamn deal with Brian Lee and Kevin Sullivan and had Stalker interfere in that, as I believe. But see, we would sometimes false book matches only to turn around and give them actually better, fresher matches. That wasn't considered false advertising, at least in my mind. But if you booked a match that when you knew something was going to happen the night before up the road, you couldn't follow through with it if the guys had turned on each other. So that was what you did. Anyway, in Morristown, Tennessee, after we've just done that house in Pikeville, which technically was about, I think, 150 miles up the road from Morristown, we did 865 people at East High School paying $5,737, which was pretty good for a Morristown show since we ran it every month. And then Thursday, April 8th, I'm fixed to give you the moral of the story. We're going to wrap this up. Thursday, April 8th in Fleming, Neon, Kentucky at the Roy T. Reeser Gym. We drew 559 people that paid $3,715 for 4 matches and a 10-man battle royal. And the next night in Paintsville, Kentucky, our good friend Ken Cantrell and the Volunteer Fire Department was our sponsors up there. The night before in Fleming, Neon, we drew 559. We go to Paintsville, which is literally, it can't be 100 miles. And we did 558 people for the same card that paid $3,766. And we would change up the finishes, right? And then we go back to Phelps, Kentucky, that was actually split the difference between the two of them, 2 towns. And we did 519 people that paid $3,575. So we're going to these goddamn little small towns in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, and drawing 500, 600, 700 people, right? And I'm thinking, well, how we've kicked things off, the exposure and all this stuff and everything is on TBS and the business that we've been doing, we're really cooking, right? April 15th comes up, Harrisonburg, Virginia. We had a small TV station, Channel 3 up there, and it was an old Crockett town. We decided to run it, and we did 259 paying $1,823, right? 8, 6, and 5. It wasn't worth the trip, but at least we took their temperature, right? And we come back to Clinchco, Virginia, which, as you'll recall, we were in a month previously. And we do another 10-man card and draw another 417 people and paid $2,721. But now here comes my weekend, Saturday, April 17th and Sunday, April 18th in Johnson City and Knoxville, where I'm going to try to do better than we did the previous month. As you'll recall, Knoxville did $8,280 and Johnson City did $6,178. About almost 1,000 people in Johnson City and almost 1,300 or whatever in Knoxville. Well, Johnson City with the Tennessee chain match, but now the people know because of television that Tracy's the champion. It's the return Tennessee chain match and the 3-team street fight showdown that I've done the hot finish for, plus Stalker against Sullivan in the brand new grudge match. Plus, Bobby Eaton is still on the card. He hadn't finished up yet, and a few other matches. Johnson City's down to 835 paid, 36 comps, and $5,577. And I'm like, oh, geez. Gosh, I hope Knoxville is better, especially because in Knoxville, you ran on Friday nights until college football. And everybody knows that on game day, Neyland Stadium in Knoxville, Tennessee is the 6th largest city in the state. You can't buck college and high school football and University of Tennessee and East Tennessee. So we would go to Sundays and then we would go back to Friday nights after March in the spring. But we couldn't get a Friday. We had to go one more Sunday this year, right? And we decided instead of an afternoon show, which was also the norm, as a matter of fact, the Sunday Bloody Sunday show, where we set our all-time record in 94 and drew 4,000 people, was a Sunday afternoon, believe it or not. But this was a Sunday night show in April. Okay. Tennessee chain match, Tracy Smothers versus the Dirty White Boy with Ron Wright for the Smoky Mountain title. 3-team showdown, street fight, studs, bodies, rock and roll, Night Stalker versus Kevin Sullivan, $5,000 challenge, Bobby Eaton versus Tim Horner, Brian Lee against Killer Kyle. 593 paid, 46 comps, and $4,000 at the gate in Knoxville, half of the previous month.
Wow.
Not we were drawing in little bitty towns in East Tennessee. Knoxville had milked me again. Knoxville had foiled me again, and I found out something valuable. Because from this point on, all of our spot shows dropped. All of our fucking main towns dropped. Everything dropped. And, of course, May was always the volunteer slam in Knoxville. That was the Rage in the Cage. That, people don't remember, didn't draw a $10,000 house. It dropped in April because tax time, Easter, the clocks changed, and the kids are fixing to get out of school, and we got to start saving money. And I know people will say, oh, yeah, I've heard all those excuses, etc. But in those days, there was validity to them. When you ran a town every month, you would detect a pattern over a period of a few years. And April and September, no matter what I did, the first time I brought Terry Funk to Knoxville was in September, and he didn't draw $4,000. And that was the same year when I hadn't figured. I knew about April, but I didn't know about September yet. April and September in Knoxville would suck donkey cocks, no matter what was in the fucking rig or what was on the card, to the point the last year in September, we gave up and sold a show to the Tennessee Valley Fair and did it in front of the grandstand and dressed in a tent rather than running the Knoxville Coliseum. In September was back to school, the Tennessee Valley Fair, starting a change in the weather where people don't want it, whatever the fuck it was. But all those things played a part. And each year I learned to get around them and not expose myself and lose my ass. But you had to be aware of things in those territory days. And if you weren't in conjunction with a big event in town, like the Mid-South Fair in Memphis or the Tennessee Valley Fair or whatever it may be, a lot of wrestling promotions would close down for a week or two if they had some big local function like that in town. And the house was always down here against the Kentucky State Fair all those years ago. So you had to learn around working. And that's why I learned to peak through trial and error my big shows to where they were likely to come. Every August, in August 93, the thing that finally got us over the hump in Knoxville, it took all that time, was finally after we hospitalized Bullet Bob, and he came back to get revenge, and the main event was me against Bob Armstrong in Knoxville, and we did almost 3,000 people and almost $20,000 at the gate. That's what finally got Knoxville, and then our lows would still be low, but our highs started getting higher. And also Christmas and Thanksgiving. We tried to always run the big towns Christmas and Thanksgiving because of reasons we've talked about. And then there were occasionally times you'd run these smaller towns in conjunction with, rather than opposition to. I remember one time in Paintsville, Kentucky, they had the Apple Festival. So we had the Big Apple Grapple. And we were outdoors at the football field right next to the stadium. We had 800 and something people in Paintsville, Kentucky, and we ran that town 4 times a year. So at any rate, as we've mentioned many times, and I know people are now saying, well, Cornette's such a financial fucking genius. Why ain't he still in business? No, it still wasn't enough for – you couldn't pay for the television and the airtime and et cetera, and still be a territory at that point in time. We figured that out. But the process of promoting live events and selling tickets has always been the same. And the principles have pretty much always been the same. And that's – you know, because once again, people here, we did a $40,000 house for the Night of Legends, and they go, wow, that's still pretty good today. Well, it was even better fucking back then because it would be the equivalent of 80 or 100 today, and nobody else was doing it. But you also got to remember that we could run these shows in Fleming Neon, Kentucky, and gross $4,000 and actually not lose any money and maybe make some. And that was the backbone of what the problem became. When we didn't get enough TV markets where we could do the big mega house in Knoxville or a Knoxville like Asheville or Greenville, Spartanburg, we also lost the ability to run the spot shows off those markets that we couldn't get. So therefore, we had to go back to our spot show towns too often, where the novelty kind of went away. And people say, well, they'll be back in a few months. They always come back. So the Clinchcos, as our big towns like Knoxville and Johnson City and Barberville was always steady, and Pikeville at the Bluegrass Brawl was always good, sold out every year. The Clinchcos and the Fleming Neons over the period of time actually started dropping off, whether our talent was good or not, because we'd been back too many times. And we couldn't open up Asheville TV or Greenville, South Carolina TV or Charleston, West Virginia TV so we could get a new group of spot show towns and spread them out more. So it was a struggle, but that was the last period of time where this was actually doable. Nobody could do it today. As you can see, try to go get a 4,000 seat fucking arena for $900. See what happens. But it was worth a try, but we hit, as usual, I had impeccable timing. And that was probably about the last point in time that anybody would ever be able to do a territory. And those guys, once again, they were working 3 or 4 days a week, and they were making the top guys were on $400 or $500 a week guarantees, but then the baby faces were cleaning up on several times that amount on merchandise if you hit a good Knoxville or Johnson City show, especially. And and then they could also work Memphis at the other end of the territory on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays if they wanted to, or they could just be off, and they were still doing better than most of the guys in the business that didn't have a contract with either WCW or the WWF.
How worried were you after April about Knoxville? Because obviously, now you could look back and you can kind of just talk about it and say, I learned a valuable lesson. But at the time, and you had so much on your shoulders.
Well,
how worried
I'll tell you what I did in May. I publicly fucking crucified and hospitalized the most popular wrestler that had ever appeared in that building. It was still living. That show to try to draw it. That's what finally drew the fucking house. When I crucified and hospitalized the most popular wrestler that had ever stepped foot in that building, it was still living. That's what it took. But then for a while there, once we got him, we had him. And then more came Christmas and more came Thanksgiving and more came for the Super Saturday Night Fever special before the Super Bowl. And then when we did that Sunday Bloody Sunday, I was fucking gobsmacked because I figured maybe we'll do better than the one with me and Bob in the lumberjack match, and we ended up instead of 18,000 something, we did fucking 33 grand. But it was a package show with so many blow-offs. It was Funk and Bullet and their blow-off, and it was, I think, us and the the Furnaces in an added match, and then us and the Bruise Brothers in the blow off, and the Rock and Roll, I think, and Lee and Candy, White Boy and Tracy, and everything. We had everything on there. So, but yeah, I was worried, and I continued to worry because May, the Rage in the Cage at the Volunteer Slam still didn't do 10 grand. We hospitalized Bob. And then his sons came back, and I'm just doing this off the top of my head now, but his sons came back, Scott and Steve, to fight the bodies that hospitalized his father in June. And I think we did like 5 or 6 grand. And July, Bullet was back in the 6-man, where I pinned him after my boys knocked him out to set up the ultimate one-on-one. And I think we probably did about 7 or 8 that month. We still couldn't get it. But then August came around. That's why the Night of Legends in 1994 was in the month of August, because the biggest house that we'd ever drawn in Knoxville and the biggest house to date that we had drawn as a company was in Knoxville in August. So I just said, okay, every year in August, I'm going to give them something, because by then, truthfully, down south, people are sick of the summer by August in the South because it's hot as fuck, and they've been outside for a long time, and they're looking for things to do because kids are about to go back to school. And parents are about to fucking have to deal with all that shit. So they've still got a little money, but they ain't going to in September. And as a matter of fact, to show you, August 93 with me against Bob Armstrong in the main event in a lumberjack match did $18,000-something and almost 3,000 people. And September, Bob Armstrong versus Terry Funk, that I had brought to Knoxville, his old nemesis, to get even with Bob. That's, like I said, did $4,000. September. Fuck it. Back to school. Everybody's pissed. And in October would kind of blow, but then November, Thanksgiving would be big, Christmas would be big, and then you'd have a nice winter down there. And then spring would suck for a couple months, and then you'd get them back in the summer. And that's the way every year, no matter what we were doing. So I just started going with it.
In terms of any actual benefit beyond the talent that you got from the WCW deal that you reached with Bill Watts that he put on paper right before he quit, got fired, whatever. Do you think it actually helped you at all in your territory? Did it help with exposure?
Oh, I think, well, obviously, as you saw, getting Arn Anderson helped. Getting Bobby Eaton helped. Getting Bobby helped for the story of the bodies and to get, because I was doing this shit like there was this underlying tension between Tom Pritchard and Bobby because they were both Stan's partner, right? And here comes the old guy that's going to Iggy the new guy out or whatever. But having talent like that, having, recognized talent like that, and the best worker in the business, Bobby Eaton, on the card helped the quality of the shows. Having Arn for those 3 or 4 big mega events that we promoted and could hang our hat on, that helped the gate. Having them not at least run against me for a few month period of time, gave us a little breathing room. It was a plus all the way around. And then, as a matter of fact, and that's where Robert Fuller, quite honestly, got the job shortly after that, due to them noticing Smoky Mountain Television going, hey, there came Colonel Robert Parker, right? And Jimmy Golden became Bunkhouse Buck. So, and I couldn't employ those guys forever. So they got jobs. It was a positive. I just wish we could have gone further. To be honest, the modern day developmental program would have sprung out of what me and Bill were trying to do. And Vince was very nice to me, and that all worked out fine. But I wish I'd have got to work with Watts a little bit more. So if it could have happened with him instead of Vince, because that was the year we were on everybody's fucking pay-per-view. Because we were done there with WCW after SuperBrawl. I made a point. As a matter of fact, I said to one of the referees, I think maybe it's Pee Wee Anderson, said, hey, good to see y'all back. And I said, don't pull up no chairs. We ain't staying. What do you mean? I said, Watts is gone. I don't trust these other fuckers. And Dusty was booking at the time, but he was not the fucker in question. It was the TBS management, right? Dusty just had the booker's job because then somebody got me said, Dusty wants to talk to you. And I went in the room. He said, kid, are we good? I said, yes, that's what. He said, well, I heard you talking about you ain't coming back. I said, no, Dusty, not because of you. I said, I'm not coming back because of the people you work for, too. And there's no heat here, but I thought Watts had the control, and so did he. And I think, and whether it was quit or fired, I think it was unanimous scenario. Things were coming to a head, and Bill was pissing as many people off as he could. And he calls me and says, I'm going home. I'm putting your shit on writing. And the next week, he's supposedly fired. We'll see. I think everybody was happy about it. But I was not going to go back and work for anybody else. Dusty I would have worked for, but he did not have the pull or the decision-making power of the person running the wrestling side of the business. And I wasn't interested in finding out who that was going to be, because it was going to be somebody else for 3 months, and then they were going to change it again, and that's what they did. But I sure do wish that we could have done it a little bit longer, and because it would have been so much easier to trade talent, because it was the same style talent that we were using that was over on TBS. It was over in Knoxville. It was close. It felt more like home. I wouldn't have to gone to all the way to fucking Alexandria Bay, New York, to do that Raw. But yeah, within 3 months after we were on SuperBrawl, that's when I got the call with the WWF, and we made their pay-per-view in SummerSlam.
But hypothetically, if Eric Bischoff, instead of editing the segment with Watts and then being aloof when you went up to him at SuperBrawl, if he had gone the other way, if he had said, Jim, I don't know you, I hear lots of good things about you from my booker, although I don't know how much longer he'll be my booker. Everyone here seems to like you and the boys. I'd love to find a way to have this working relationship continue. What can we do? I mean, would you have at least been open to it, or was it, if Watts wasn't there, you weren't going to be there?
Well, I'd like to say I would have been open to it, because that sounds like such a very convivial statement, right? Very nice. But here's the thing. If it had been Eric Bischoff saying it to me, I would have. So what the fuck? If I don't trust Dusty Rhodes, who I know, who is someone in the wrestling business, who is not only someone, but one of the someones, and recognized by everybody in the world, if they're not giving him the pull, if they didn't give Bill Watts the pull, if they didn't give Ric Flair when he was the booker and I was working for him on the committee, if they didn't leave him alone then why would I think that this fucking guy that honestly nobody had ever heard of except people that watched Vern Gagne's B Show, and I'm not knocking Eric now, but that's who he was then. He was no fucking body. Why I would have said, well, can you get somebody in charge to come up and we'll talk about it? But there was nobody there that at that point he wouldn't have that much power for 2 more years. See, that's the thing. Because this was 1993, not 1995.
Yeah, Bob Dew, I think, was still there as his boss, yeah, maybe.
I had worked for Jim Herd and hated him. Ric Flair had been supposedly the booker, and he put me on the booking committee, but he had resigned because Herd wouldn't leave him alone, even though he was supposed to have full control over the wrestling side of things. Then I had seen a succession of people who were supposed to have full control over the wrestling side of things in 1990 before I walked out. Then I've been talking and doing business with a guy who really didn't even the title of booker, but had the title of vice president of wrestling operations or whatever the fuck it was, and had been told himself he had full control over everything related to wrestling, and I was dealing directly with him, and we don't even get to the pay-per-view, and he's gone. With my track record with that company, why would I believe a guy that I'd never met before? The only thing I'd ever heard about him was that he's the one that edited the shoot angle that we did on the Saturday night TBS show behind Bill Watts's back. And I'm like, this little fucking prick, whoever the fuck he is, Coffee Boy, has edited mine and Bill Watts's work, because that's who Eric Bischoff was then. He was fucking nobody. So no, I wouldn't have listened to him saying it. If Dusty had said that, I would have said, Dusty, the same thing I said when Dusty called me back down here to try to get me to come back in 91. Dusty, I'd love to work for you if I was working for you, but you're working for somebody and I don't trust them. So I don't think there was anybody there at that point that could have said those words were great, but there was nobody that could have said them to me that I would have believed.
All right, 2 last questions, then I'll leave you to fuck alone. Obviously, you have your animosity.
You've been around me too long.
You have your well-deserved animosity towards Turner Broadcasting and their executives. You're dealing with Bill Watts, who, if he didn't have it when he walked in the door, quickly gained the exact same feelings that you had for those same executives.
Yeah.
Jim Ross is pushed out with Bill Watts. During this period of time, are you in communication with Jim Ross? And secondly, you go back to SuperBrawl, to that pay-per-view, and Jim Ross isn't there, Bill Watts isn't there, but Ric Flair returns. Do you talk to Rick that night?
Oh, God, yeah. No, we caught up with David Crockett and Doug Dillinger. And as a matter of fact, I'm getting off on another story. You asked me about Flair. Yes, and it was great to see him. And as I mentioned before, I had talked to him when I was opening Knoxville. Rick Rubin had said, if you can get Flair to work for us once a month, I'll give him $10,000 a shot. But, he chose to go work for Vince. Well, I guess sometimes you just have to do these things. But so he was happy that we were running. And as a matter of fact, I think that's when he started kidding me, because remember, him and Blackjack Mulligan at one point had bought Knoxville and that East Tennessee territory after the split in the Southeastern exposed business, fucked everything up. And so he said, you need to start sending me a fucking percentage. I've lost enough money on Knoxville. And that had been 12 years previously or whatever. So we joked about that. And once again, I almost got in a fight leaving the building in Asheville. I forgot this SuperBrawl with that. They had some fucking security or production guy named Bear or something. Since I had been gone, this guy had come along. So when we got there, because me and the bodies came in late, right, from Asheville or from Johnson City, I see David Crockett in the parking lot. I said, David, where should I park? He said, just pull up right there. We got room to get by. It was next to some fucking thing, whatever. Okay. So, and Brian Hildebrand had ridden with us. So we get ready to leave at night. Stan's getting a ride with Tommy Young on back to Charlotte, I think, where he was living. And Tom and Brian are going back to Tennessee with me. And Brian's gone out first, and Tom's saying goodbye to some of the boys. It was a very pleasant experience. The only person I got mad and told off, I didn't get mad, I just told off, was Bischoff. Because he had been buried to me for, changing the angle. But everybody else we visited, and we left. So Brian's gone to the car first, and I'm following, and Doc's coming. And Brian's coming up the ramp outside the back of the Asheville Civic Center. They're going to tow your car. I said, what do you mean? And there's this big, I didn't know who he was, this Bear guy, right? Your production guy. And he's, we're going to have to tow this car. I said, hold on, brother. So we're fixed to move. I said, I'm waiting on a guy. David Crockett told us to park there. I didn't know that he had no idea who I was, because I figure if I've just been on the fucking show, if you work for this company, probably if you just looked, I was out there, right? So he starts getting smart with me like I'm just some fucking mark that's just wandered up and parked there to go to the wrestling show. And I'm waiting on Tom, and I said, Brian, go ahead and tell Tom to hurry up. And I said, buddy, because we're the only humans out there. There's nothing trying to get by. It's out back of the Asheville Civic Center in the middle of the night. Nothing's moving, right? But he's going to make sure we're not, in case the big TV trucks need to move before, in the next minute, we're not blocking them in. I said, buddy, I'm going to move that car here in about 2 minutes, and we're going to be gone and out of your way. We just got finished with the show. One of the boys is headed back from the shower. So I'm just going to go put my shit in the car, and we'll be out of your way in a second. Well, see that you do. I said, you're giving me the attitude that you're a fucking prick. And I believe I've mentioned to you that we're all leaving and there ain't no issue here. So why don't you walk away from me and let's leave it that way? And as I start to go to the car and Brian's standing there, he said, have a nice night, civilian. What the fuck? Like he's a goddamn General MacArthur. I've rolled over my goddamn cord telling this story. I'm fucking having fun. I said, I said, motherfucker. I said, if you say one more word to me, we are going to have a fucking fight right here in this goddamn parking lot. You're being a fucking prick, and I'm going to my car. You see me walking to my car, leave it alone. And as I turn around to walk to the car, he goes, 10-4. I threw the bag down and I start back up the fucking ramp, right? And Brian Hildebrand grabs me around the fucking waist, but he only weighs 140 pounds and I was 250 at this point, and I'm running and I'm dragging him, right? And I'm going to kill you, you motherfucker. And this fucking Bear guy immediately, he does two things. He goes to his lapel where they got the budget now for walkie-talkies at WCW now, right? In the lapel thing, like the Secret Service deal. He goes, call Doug Dillinger in the Asheville PD. Call Doug Dillinger in the Asheville PD. I said, yeah, call Doug Dillinger, motherfucker, because I've known Doug Dillinger for 10 fucking years. And as I'm running out of Brian's grip, the second thing the guy does, he pulls out one of those butterfly knives and flips it open. Now he's got a fucking knife on me. So Brian sees this, and I let go of fucking Brian, and he lets go of me, and I'm able to pick up a small metal pipe that is laying there by the side of the fucking ramp. Well, I say small, it was 2 or 3 fucking feet long, but this motherfucker's pulled a knife on me, right? So I don't want to get close enough to him for he can cut me before I can hit him with this fucking deal, but something's going to happen here. But before it does, because I'm screaming, now he's backing up. He's got a knife, but he's backing up for me with the fucking thing. And finally, goddamn, I'm screaming, you fucking gutless, won't fight pussy, come over here. And here comes Doug Dillinger and the Asheville PD. And they are running triple time. And the look on Doug's face when he sees that their production guy and head honcho Bear or whatever his fucking, he was on the credits of the show, so somebody can look up his fucking name. He was a fucking idiot. When they see that Doug Dillinger sees it's Jim Cornette backing Bear up and Bear's got a knife pulled on me, he said, what the fuck is going on here? And I said, this fucking guy's a smart ass, and he was mouthing off to me, and I tried to walk off from him, and when I did, he mouthed off further, and when I tried to kick his ass, he's such a gutless pussy, he pulled a fucking knife on me. That about sums it up, Doug. And he looks at this guy, he says, Jim, go on, get in your car, I'll take care of him. And I don't know what they said to this fucking guy. I never saw him again, obviously, because I never worked for the company again on purpose. But with Doug Dillinger, the last thing he thought of in his mind that night was, I'm going to have to pull Jim Cornette off, one of our production people who's pulled a knife on him. So then we got in the car and went back to Knoxville, and that was the end of that.
You didn't answer the question about Jim Ross.
Oh, no, because as soon as JR was gone from Atlanta, he transitioned pretty much immediately. It wasn't at that time.
But are you talking to him during this time? Not are you trying to get him to work for you? But
well, I thought you meant because he did the following year. No, actually, I don't. I think when it all happened, I just went back in the Smoky Mountain cocoon, right? It'd been wonderful working with him again, and we'd caught up at the TV tapings. But I said, when I heard about it, I was like, good. They've lost JR now too, so they're going to be in the fucking weeds even worse. And when you think about it, 93 and 94 were pretty much even worse than 91 and 92 for them because they'd lost Watts and JR. And then once he'd started with Vince, no, we didn't. At the time, if I was on the phone, it was with somebody that was either doing business with Smoky Mountain Wrestling or was on my fucking card that following Friday. And even then it was stressful. But then the following year, obviously, when Vince let him go the first time for whatever that bullshit reason was, and then that's when he and Dennis Brent were starting to do the 800 number stuff and starting to do different things or the 900 number.
900, yeah.
And so that's when we started talking to see if he could help out with Smoky Mountain number. And I said, hey, how about doing some TV? And it was 3 hours down the road. So that's when I was able to, when you think about it, Smoky Mountain Wrestling was on TV pretty much 4 years. We did 200 episodes. And in the time I had Lance Russell, Les Thatcher, Jim Ross, and Bob Caudle, among others, announce for us. That ain't bad.
Chip Kessler right now is sitting somewhere weeping.
Chip was great. Chip was fucking great. He was a good wrestler. He was not cosmetically pleasing on camera, but because he was a radio guy and he was a wrestling fan. Especially in the old days, he would have been a wrestling territory announcer like a Sterling Brewer in Birmingham that just had that stentorian voice and that pronunciation. But Sterling Brewer was not an emotional person on camera. Neither was Chip necessarily emotional in a visual way.
You know, Jim, we did Bluegrass Brawl, and actually it ends up really being Bluegrass Brawl and SuperBrawl 93. In the next few months, you know what we should do on here? We should do the summer of 93 in Smoky Mountain. You know, that fire on the mountain, everything else that was happening. At the same time as SummerSlam 93. You know, July and August for Jim Cornette in 93.
Oh, good Lord.
Well,
really as a matter of fact, exciting time. It almost gave me a goddamn nervous breakdown because I'll tell you this. Hold on here. I've just got my book in my hand.
Plus, you did the Real Wrestling Hotline with Jim Hurd, Lance Russell, Dave Meltzer, John Arezzi.
I still swear I didn't know Jim Hurd was involved while I was doing it, and it was a very short period of time. But I'll just give you a tease. Here's what I did the week of SummerSlam 93, and we'll go into detail at a later date. On Friday, August 27th, I was in Hazard, Kentucky, wrestling in a 10-man Falls Count Anywhere match against the Armstrong family in the Rock and Roll. On August 28th, I was in Duffield, Virginia at the Duffield Primary School wrestling the Armstrongs in a six-man. After the show, I drove to Charlotte, North Carolina, where I stayed over and flew the next day to fucking New York City, where I was on Monday, August 30th, Regis and Kathy Lee that morning on ABC, and then in Detroit, Michigan at SummerSlam that night, managing both title matches. Did Grand Rapids, Michigan TV on the 31st, and Saginaw, Michigan TV on the 1st, while was still running a show in Tazewell, Tennessee at the Claiborne County Fair that night that was a sold show, and then finally got back to Tennessee on the 2nd in time to drive to Council, Virginia and be in a six-man tag against the Armstrongs on Friday, September 3rd. And in a cage match the following night in Barberville against Bullet Bob Armstrong, and in a six-man in Saltville, Virginia the following afternoon against the Armstrong family. That was just 10 days of my fucking life in 1993, folks.
It's amazing your health wasn't worse during Smoky Mountain Wrestling.
It was.
I remember how bad it was, but it's amazing it wasn't worse.
It's amazing that I didn't have a fucking heart attack or a stroke. No, especially and to get to the WWF TVs almost every time, instead of flying out of Knoxville, I would drive to Charlotte because then I could get a nonstop because chances are, if the Knoxville connections back then were like fucking Hooterville. So to make sure I could get out easier and quicker, I'd do a show on Saturday night or even a Sunday in Smoky Mountain, drive to Charlotte overnight, fly out the next morning to the Northeast and do the TVs and then get back. But sometimes I would drive if I had time. I drove a loop where we did TV in Massachusetts and Burlington, Vermont one time out of Tennessee, just to fucking get away from airplanes. But if we had shows, I remember for Survivor Series 93, which was the night before Thanksgiving. It was a Wednesday night, right? Back in those days, they didn't do actual Thanksgiving night on pay-per-view. But at any rate, on Tuesday, November 23rd of 93, I flew to Boston. I did the Survivor Series where the Rock and Roll worked with the Bodies, and then I managed Yoko against Undertaker at the Boston Garden on the 24th, and then flew back through Charlotte to Knoxville on the 25th, got in the car and drove 4 hours to Hazard, Kentucky for our Thanksgiving, the start of our 4-day Thanksgiving Thunder tour that night. So I was in Hazard on Thanksgiving, Knoxville the next day, Barberville, Kentucky the next day, and Johnson City the next day, and then had 1 day off so that I could drive to Charlotte and then fly back to Springfield, Massachusetts to pick up the TV tapings. Because I couldn't do all the WWF TVs because of not only the Smoky Mountain house show schedule, but also 1 day a week, usually on Wednesday, but sometimes it varied. I had to be either in Knoxville or later in Chattanooga to supervise the post-production of that week's television show. So in 94 and 95, when we switched from Tennessee Production Center in Knoxville, which was only 40 miles from my house in Morristown, to Chattanooga, once a week I would drive 140 miles to the TV studio in Chattanooga and spend all night, overnight, supervising the post-production, and drive back to get back home about 9 o'clock the next day so I could hopefully have a day off to write and make phone calls before we started the next house show loop. It was it was ridiculous that I did these things, and I'm surprised that I didn't have a stroke and die or kill somebody, because there were.
Well, you tried.
I can think of 6 dozen times that I could have done something that would have sent me to a long stint in prison just in that 4-year period. But don't fuck with a guy when he's fucking stressed and vibrating. That's the moral of that story.
Was Charlotte closer than Atlanta would have been from Morristown, Tennessee?
Yes, and it was an easier drive, and it was an easier in and out on the airport, because Atlanta, the parking situation was chaos, the size of the airport was chaos, etc. Charlotte had there was the hub, plus we still had the relationship with the executive parking guy. It was a great deal back in those days. You pull up at this executive parking thing, and they knew all the boys, so they'd hop right in your car, and you would drive to the front gate where you got out and checked your bag, and they would drive your car back and park it for you. And then when you got back, you called and they'd bring it to you for like $10 a day. So yes, Atlanta was closer and easier. Charlotte was a little closer and a lot easier than Atlanta would have been.
And one last thing. I know I said this a few times, but I'm going to ask one more question here. When I look back at the SuperBrawl card, one of the matches I remember was Too Cold Scorpio versus Chris Benoit. So that makes me think, if the relationship had continued with Watts, Did you have an expectation that guys like that who weren't the main event, who were at best upper mid-card, you'd have access to them for shows?
Well, it didn't go long enough where I could take it down to making my individual wish list. But yes, I would have. I would have had access. And a guy like that, unless he was coming back off an injury or they wanted to, like with Bobby, Watts was just disgusted at some of the things they'd done with him booking-wise and wanted to freshen him up. And I don't know what his freshening would have been because by the time Bobby came back, Watts was gone. But it probably would have been more significant to what they did with him. But I didn't expect to get a lot of guys on long-term basis, but I thought, boy, if I can get the surprise mystery partner, or if I can get a top guy to come in every once in a while and fucking I can manage him against my Smoky Mountain champion and he does a fucking job and my guy and my champion, babyface champion beats a recognized TV heel or just whatever, it would have made sense depending. I wouldn't have just said, who can you give me this week? I would have said, hey, can I have such and such guy for such and such date? But I wanted Benoit. It wasn't a fucking year later. Owen Hart arranged for Chris Benoit to have a dark match at a WWF taping, and he and I was managing Owen at the time, so I went and took a couple bumps for Chris too because we were like, why doesn't this guy have a fucking job, right? He's fucking fantastic, and so Owen had a great match with him. I took bumps for him. We put him over like $1 million, and then I remember asking Bruce Pritchard at some point later on, hey, are they going to bring fucking Benoit? Well, we offered that he can work dates in Canada, but he didn't just want to do that. And I said, why the fuck wouldn't they want him? This was one of the first of a long series of asking these questions. Why wouldn't you offer this guy or they want this guy for a full-time job? Well, it ain't personality. What the fuck? All right. But that's, so every time I found somebody to get him a dark match or I saw somebody in a dark match that I would have used in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, they said they didn't have any Rhino. When I screamed, I was like, no, you got to look at this fucking guy. He's 23 years old. His fucking thighs are as big around as my waist. He does the diving headbutt like fucking Benoit off the top. And he didn't have any personality. Oh, Jesus fucking Christ.
Did you work the taping when Sabu got his tryout in 93?
Yes. And as a matter of fact, and I'll be honest, I hope it doesn't hurt Sabu's feelings, and I enjoy him and Super Genie are great people. But I did tell Vince, you got to watch this guy. He does some wild shit. He's the Sheik's nephew, blah, blah, blah. Put him over to start because I was excited to see him. But at the time, Sabu was doing some great shit on TV. I was not aware that the TV that I was seeing was being edited by Paul Heyman to give me the impression that Sabu could do that great shit every time he tried it. Because there's nothing, and here's for expiring young wrestlers or aspiring young wrestlers, if you ever get a chance to fucking try out for Vince McMahon or anybody that looks like Vince McMahon, don't do stupid shit and miss it. If you bring a chair in the ring and you're going to do a fucking springboard or whatever, that right off the bat pretty much buried it to begin with because you just didn't do shit like that back then. But or off the ropes or what, that's what buried Al Snow when he was first seen because he was used to cables and he went to do a springboard that I'd never seen him miss, fell right on his face because they were them fucking real ropes they used back then. I guess still do. I hate them fucking things. That buried Al Snow for a year and a half. And Sabu missed some shit. And plus Vince just didn't get it at the time. Sabu was trying to be, as time went on, it would almost become a parody of things like, why is Sabu mad at the furniture? Why is he mad at that table? There's nobody on it. He just went through it. And it became kind of silly, to be honest. But at the time that he was at his peak right there, he athletically, and he looked like the homicidal, genocidal, lunacidal, whatever, maniac.
Lunacidal?
Well, whatever. Homicidal, genocidal, patricidal. And I
remember when Taz
whatever the fuck
Taz was doing the ECW shirts. That was one of Taz's tasks for Paul Heyman. And he did a Sabu shirt, and no one could ever figure out if this happened because he had heat with Sabu or he just couldn't spell. But the back of the Sabu shirt said homicidal instead of homicidal. H-O-M-O.
Homicidal.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, the point is Sabu was doing a bunch of indie stuff, and they weren't looking for indie stuff at that point. That's what hurt him on his tryout. It just didn't work. But there you have it.
And there it is.
Do you think anybody stayed with that whole thing by this time? But
I
that's
think it got better
folks.
as it kept going.
Back in the days in the territories, that's the way it was. And yes, it's a wonder. I think we've all now realized that Jim Cornette should have been in prison or dead of a heart attack or a stroke a long time ago.